We're going to shift now into the first of the 4 panels that will ground our engagement with each other and our learnings. The first one, we have set this up very intentionally. The first panel has an extraordinary set of experts who are going to be talking about the problem of polarization. I'm going to leave it to our moderator to lead it, but it is followed by 3 panels, each of them followed by a breakout session where we're going to look to everybody out there to engage with each other and with moderators in these 15-minute breakouts and really engage and share and learn. And those will be guided later on, but I wanted to just flag where we are right now. So it's my pleasure right now to introduce Sarah Ruger, who is the moderator of our next panel on the problem of polarization. Sarah leads free expression efforts for the Stand Together community and the Charles Koch Institute, including the Charles Koch Foundation's Courageous Collaborations Initiative, which supports a field of researchers and educators and leaders and activists understanding and applying tools to foster peaceful pluralism. She previously managed external relations to the Institute for Humane Studies. She's written for a variety of prominent outlets, including USA Today. And we have a personal connection because she was the driving force behind the coalition that came together 3 years ago around confronting extremism and brought both vision and the necessary ideological diversity that we need to address all of these issues. We have conservative and liberal and progressive and moderate viewpoints represented all throughout the voices that you'll hear today. And so I just wanted to mention that. And with that, it's Sarah, I wanted to turn it over to you for your beginning panel.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. It's delightful to be with you all. I wish it was in person, but this is better than nothing for sure. And apologies in advance if you hear a hound howling in the background. There's nothing I can do about that. He is passionate about polarization as we are and wants his voice heard. So as Mike mentioned, I work for both Stand Together and the Charles Koch Institute, and this issue is just at the heart of the work that we're trying to support around and in support of peaceful pluralism. And we've got a lot of ground to cover today because our goal is to help set the scene a little bit and provide the research and context around the problem so that as you all, as audience members and field and sector leaders in your own right, have the context and the knowledge that you need to really grapple with this with us today and have enough knowledge of the problem to really be able to speak into how we might be able to work together to address it. I know some of our panelists have a hard stop at 11:30, so unfortunately we're going to not have Q&A in this panel, but please, from the audience, but please drop questions that you have in the chat and you will have an opportunity to engage with these ideas in the breakouts that are going to follow this session. I have the unenviable task here now of trying to condense the esteemed bios of this panel into just a couple minutes so that we can dive right into discussion. But trust me, these are folks whose full body of work you're going to want to take the time to check out after this panel. So I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is one of the world's foremost experts on rule of law, security, governance in fragile states. Essentially, if you can think of a major domestic or international governing body, she's probably advised it. And I've really thought of her over the last year as just a critical leader in bringing best practices from an international context around political violence prevention to the U.S. at this pivotal moment around our own election and crises. We're also joined by Dr. Kareem Crayton, who is a nationally respected scholar and expert on, among other issues, elections, voting, and governance. He served as faculty at multiple universities and has led a civil rights law firm to 2 Supreme Court arguments in the last 2 years. He has since then resumed management of Crim Card Consulting Services, which provides cutting-edge research and analytical advice to entities and organizations on issues related to the electoral process, including redistricting, which is going to be a hot issue in the coming years. And finally, we're joined by Professor Wiseman, who is a professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. He has his PhD from Stanford, and he is a leading expert on many, many issues, including legislative effectiveness and what makes our political institutions like Congress, like the executive branch, effective or not, really studying the impact of political institutions on political actors' behavior and strategies. So I know he's going to have a lot of insight today around these institutions and how they apply to polarization. So I'd love to just kick off with a question that I'll ask each of our panelists to spend about 5 minutes addressing from their unique perspective. Maybe starting with Dr. Kleinfeld, would love for you to give us some context for the roots of this trend around polarization. How did we get here? How concerning is this threat based on your knowledge from international experience? Really, what warning signs do you see that we need to pay special attention to in this moment?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for having me on this fabulous panel. I wish we could be in person. I will try to make this tight because I realize we have hard ends. But I do want to take a minute at the beginning. I heard, yesterday, I'm sure many of us saw the tweet from the Secretary of State of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, that she's been getting death threats and violent threats against her for doing her job. She's certainly not the only one. I was on a call 2 days ago where a woman who was an election auditor for Colorado, not quite as boring as legal footnotes, Mary, but election audits were not considered sexy jobs previously. She broke down in tears at the number of election workers who are getting doxxed, are getting threatened, and so on. This is the United States of America, and we used to teach other countries how to run democracies. And I think we just need to take a big step and recognize that the polarization we're facing is not only measured in the lives of people in our country, but it's also measured in the lives of people in other countries where their democracies are faltering because our democracy is faltering, and it's being used as an excuse for authoritarianism around the world. So we're facing, the world faces two kinds of polarization. One is policy differences. Lots of scholars measure polarization this way because frankly, it's easy. We are not actually all that polarized on policy. If you look at issues like immigration, gun control, even abortion, you can find large majorities, people from both parties who share broad views on these very tough issues. That is not the problem. What we have is affective polarization here. And that's where we actually change our policy views to fit the preferences of our group. So you see a flip on Russia, for instance, or a flip on nuclear fuel, maybe in the left wing, because we are part of a tribe. We have disgust for the other tribe and we want to stay with our tribe. That's the kind of polarization that we're talking about here. And it's very different than policy polarization. It also means that policies don't translate into politics because affective polarization keeps our politics so toxic. How did we come to this? Where did we get to? There's lots of questions that are still open. Scholars have only just created this differentiation between the two. We used to mush them together, which made it much harder to talk about them. It looks like political structures influence affective polarization. So our first past the post system where you get 50.1% of the vote and you win, that makes it more likely to polarize, but it's not determinative. Formative rifts may make countries more likely to be polarized. If you're broken by race, as America has been since our beginning, Northern Ireland by religion, Kenya by tribe, Colombia by class, those formative rifts make it more likely, but again, they're not determinative. You can actually see, I've got small children, so we read the Sneetches. Some had stars on their tummies and some didn't. You can use anything to actually polarize a country. It doesn't have to be quite so deep, although the deeper ones go deeper. In America, our problem, among others, is that our divisions increasingly line up. So if you are of one race, if you are of one party, if you are of one geography, and so on, all those things start lining up so you don't have cross-cutting identities as much. You don't see a lot of deeply religious Democrats in rural areas who are African American. That just is rarer and rarer, and it used to be much more common. That makes it more easy to polarize. The real factor that we found in polarization is entrepreneurial politicians. Politicians who decide that they're going to use polarizing strategies to mobilize identity groups to vote for them. And by using hatred for the other, these polarizing politicians can alter the political landscape extraordinarily quickly. consider how fast Britain is polarized in the Brexit conversation, from a very moderate kind of third way sort of politics to really quite extreme politics in about 2 years. You see that in many, many countries, this just sudden slide that takes people by surprise. You can trace it back. There are lines back. In America, there are clearly lines back to the mid-60s, where our culture wars and our racial change at that point led to our politics dividing by race, our political parties dividing largely by race, and the other changes piling on top: women's issues, homosexual rights, all sorts of different rights issues piling on one side. So you can trace it back, but we didn't have that polarization until quite recently. And then those politicians use warlike rhetoric, violent rhetoric to increase the ante. Social media can make it worse, but it's actually probably not a catalyzing factor. It's a exacerbating factor. Various scholars have done research on social media, and what they found is that greater internet use is not associated with faster political polarization. And cross-country trends show that Europeans use social media, but they're not as polarized as Americans. It's skyrocketing here. It is not skyrocketing there. In fact, in some places it's declining. So we see it as an exacerbating factor of the polarized trends that already exist rather than a catalyst. I'll close with, what does it do? At the institutional level, it can lead to gridlock. It can lead to democratic erosion because these politicians don't want checks from democratic institutions or from citizens. They don't want media checks and so on. They tend to use undemocratic means to push their policies forward. They politicize the judiciary in nearly every country that they exist in. And the problem with what that does, among other things, is that not only does it decrease democracy in and of itself, because these politicians are trying to get around democratic institutions, but it makes democracy itself a football in the polarization game. So your take on where you stand on democratic institutions lines you up on one side of the polarization. You can't fight for democracy from a neutral ground. That is incredibly detrimental to democracy. It's also detrimental at the societal level. We now have marriage sorting by political party in America. That used to be racial. I suppose maybe it's better that it's partisan instead of racial, but it's still not good. We have geographic sorting by political party. It reduces GDP. When you get really severe affective polarization, people want to do business with their group and not with the other group. You see this in tribal and racial polarization in other countries, but you can imagine it here with partisan polarization pretty quickly. And it can also lead to violence, because under conditions where institutions are weak and unequal, where social trust is reduced, where you have high levels of inequality, and where you have a history of political violence, and America fits every single one of those checkboxes, what you get is polarization itself and the politicization of law enforcement bodies because of the polarization, the way that law enforcement bodies play into that polarization. And we can talk with Mary about this later, or we can just discuss it later. Creates more incentive for police brutality in many countries. The police have more impunity if they fall on one side of that political divide. And there's more incentive for citizen on citizen violence from one side of the polarized divide to the other. And because the police tend to take a side, you get marginalized communities using violence against each other without the police stepping in to support them as much. So I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a tremendous amount of ground artfully covered in a short period of time. So thank you for setting that stage. I'd love to pick up on something that you raised and maybe turn now to Dr. Crayton. Rachel mentioned some deep-seated divisions in America, and as an expert in key institutions and our legal history and the structures that are fueling this process, would love to have you share your perspective on what brought us to this point and what's undergirding all of these trends.
Sure, and thank you for posing the question just that way. I'll start, of course, by thanking the organizers, Fetzer, Vanderbilt, and Millions of Conversations for setting this up, but hasten right to the point. I think this is a really important time for us to start thinking about these questions. It's probably overdue. I think of it a little bit differently, which is not necessarily to be in conflict with what Rachel just offered a moment ago, but it is to get to what is the root of all of this. It has been said a couple of times today that this is probably a fairly new moment for us insofar as our democracy has really only incorporated as a formal matter the entirety of its population that's eligible since the 60s. And while we celebrate the fact that 160 million ballots were cast, the largest number ever, and that we have gone since 2004, if you think about it, since there have been 4 white men contesting for the presidency and vice presidency among the major parties. So there are people 16 years old driving around who've never seen what has been the norm for most of us on this Zoom call. That's different, not to mention, of course, that we now have a vice president-elect who's a woman of color. But it's also very important to understand that with the advent of more people and voices, you are seeing more evidence of this polarization. And while all the other things that have been said about the pieces that have led to some level of polarization across a lot of different dimensions, what's important to say is we have a system that has been designed in its origins to not allow large percentages of its population to participate in an election. And now that we have more people participating, you have more differences being articulated. Now, those differences range in sort of the sort of more political dimensions. I disagree with you about a policy, to now, and what is disturbing to me, and I think most of us in this discussion would agree, when the differences are, I don't think you should be a part of this community, or perhaps I don't think you should exist, it's problematic. The challenge is, how do we take a system that was born of, I think, an inherent flaw, and remake it in a way that allows not just people to sort of participate in an episodic manner, right? When you've got a pandemic, when you have people viewing this election as a do or die moment, but how do we design a system that allows us to do this on a regular basis? And one of the real challenges of a democratic system generally is that you want people who may happen to be on the losing end of a particular election outcome to believe that the system is legitimate enough to play it again, right? And all of the comments that have been offered earlier suggest that we're in a moment where, for the first time in a long time, we've got people who are saying, and not whispering it, we don't think this system is legitimate. And that should raise warning flags for a lot of us. But as I say, the roots of this aren't necessarily shallow. It goes back a ways. But I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One of them is that we look at this idea of a particular kind of polarization, race polarization, particularly in the South. I spend a lot of time writing and working in this area. You see the same swath of states. If you proceed from Texas going east, roughly in the middle part of each one of the states, I normally have maps. Since we are speaking in such a short period, I won't, but I can send along a map. You've seen it. It's called the Black Belt. It is a distinct political region that represents jurisdictions that are usually majority Black, but not always, majority people of color, and they usually operate in manners that express different political views from the rest of the state. So the idea of a red state is sort of an illusion, as now evidenced by Georgia. There are places, large chunks of states, that don't agree with the overall viewpoints of the states, and it's not just partisan, it is racial. And that has often gotten submerged in our discourse about how we think about politics. But within those states, the challenge is we've got partisanship that is expressed as a manner of race identity, and that becomes a challenge. And this isn't an attack on people, certainly, who've been fenced out of the process. It's a story about what it means to be the governing and dominating party that understands its continued control as being expressed by race identity. And that becomes a real challenge. Is there space for us to think about arguments that don't go to who we are and go instead to what we believe and what we want out of government? That opens up the space, I think, as Rachel was suggesting earlier, where there can be compromise and the push and pull of normal politics. Where we don't have that, it becomes a real problem. Let me just offer a couple of potential shifts in our structure that might make this more possible. And I think there are going to be questions that come up that go back to the questions about law and how we use law to shape institutions. One of the big questions that affects us is who counts. There are big cases coming before the Supreme Court involving the census. Whether the census gets reported out, who counts in it? There's an argument that a lot of people have offered, and sadly, they've been very partisan in their information about whether or not citizens only ought to be counted. The census in its design is to count everyone. There are people now for political purposes who want to only count citizens. That's one example. The second is in the process of thinking about the Voting Rights Act. Our level of having federal protections against discrimination in the application of elections, who gets access to the ballot box, whether those the systems that determine who wins and who loses take account of racial differences. Those things matter. And as of 2013, our Supreme Court determined that the application of the law as it had existed since 1965 ought to change, because in their view, race no longer divided the public as it did before. One wonders what 2020 Supreme Court would say about 2013. And the final piece of this is redistricting. We are about to engage in a process of dividing districts to allocate political power, not just at the congressional level, but even at the local levels. And in those places, whether you're talking about partisan-driven district drawing, where you're dealing with Congress or the state legislatures, or whether you're dealing in a nonpartisan context, cities and counties often, what is typically the case is that elites, that is the elected people, are making decisions on behalf of the people, at least ostensibly. Usually the people don't have a fulsome role in the process. We're seeing the advent now of new structures that allow citizens to take control of that themselves and to find these common bonds and to identify places where they can agree that go beyond partisanship and create the possibility that race doesn't define primarily where people decide to put a lot of their political weight. These have to be nurtured and developed, and this will be the first decade where that happens in a fulsome way. The challenge, and I think the question, is whether or not we have opportunities to see all of these different viewpoints come into the fore and get taken seriously when decisions get taken. But going forward, I think that's really the test of whether, when we see 2024, 2028, these election results at the national level, whether we see people look in addition to race among other different identities that bring people together as opposed to divide them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crayton. Professor Wiseman, I'd love to turn to you now. There are kind of two threads that I'm hoping you can pick up on that we've heard from all of the speakers thus far. One being that our political institutions are under stress. We view our political opposites as not just wrong, but evil. I think we've all seen the research on declining trust in political institutions like Congress, like politics at a national scale. Also, we're hearing that a lot of the structure of these political institutions may be at the root of the polarization challenges that we face. Would just love to invite you to expand on that, maybe also to speak into what you're seeing in terms of how broader popular opinion is trending around these issues and what implications that all has for our ability to have a flourishing democratic system.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much to the organizers for having me, or giving me the opportunity to participate in this forum. And also let me apologize in advance. I'm going to be even pithier than normal because I'm actually the person that has a binding constraint to have to teach in 17 minutes on campus. So let me just start off by saying I really appreciate the comments by Rachel and Kareem, and much of my gut reactions that I was initially going to speak to really reinforce both of their points, even though they're complementary. One point I really want to hammer home, however, that Rachel started off with is, she summarized the overwhelming body of academic research quite parsimoniously when she stated that contrary to public perceptions, we as a nation are really not polarized on policy. On issue after issue after issue, even on highly contentious issues such as abortion policy, there's a substantial amount of middle ground that is not nearly as polarized as we're often being perceived to be or presented to be in either the mainstream media, the blogosphere, etc. Even more so, I'd argue, and my main area of academic research is the U.S. Congress in particular. I'd also want to make sure, if there's one pearl of wisdom that hopefully comes out of today's session, or at least my ramblings, I would hope it'd be that, contrary to the way we are constantly being presented these images, the United States Congress is not now more polarized than we've ever been at any point in our American history, not by a long margin. In fact, I think it's very important that whenever people hear these claims, they recognize that our perceptions of polarization are going to be heavily influenced by how we're measuring it. And in the United States Congress, for example, we see these common histograms that are put up that show Republicans on the right, Democrats on the left, this vast gulf in between the two of them. But it's important to recognize that all those histograms, any graph we ever see is completely an artifact of a collection of votes that these people cast in public forums. And I would be the first person to note the voting agenda has changed significantly across the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But if you dive under the surface, it's actually the case that there's quite a bit of behavior that goes into the process of lawmaking that really hasn't changed substantially over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, the extent to which we see, for example, meaningful bipartisan collaboration as exhibited by co-sponsorship patterns between Republicans and Democrats, they've been essentially consistent across the past 30 to 40 years. There haven't been meaningful differences. Now, that being said, the things that we ultimately vote on, those have changed, and that's largely going to be a function of who are the party leaders in Congress that are structuring the agenda, okay? But it's important to realize, I mean, let's just be really blunt. Anyone that sits there and says, yeah, we're more divided than we ever were since the Civil War, in 1856, we had a member of the US House walk into the Senate and cane a member of the Senate to the ground until the point he almost died. And even though this might seem like an outlier behavior, this behavior was heralded as an act of heroism in major newspapers across regions of the United States. As contentious as political debate is getting in the United States Congress, I'm willing to bet that if someone walked into the Senate and caned someone to the ground, you would not hear just major overwhelming support across really any media outlet, contrary to the way we might perceive it. Likewise, it's also important to recognize that even though public opinion of Congress has been going downward rapidly, building on or respond to your question earlier, Sarah, for those of you that have been thinking about this in any meaningful context, I mean, really, public approval of Congress right now is roughly about 18 to 20% on a good day, which actually represents a high watermark in certain ways compared to the last 4 to 5 years. At one point, we were close to single digits. But it's interesting to note, if we take a look at the 80s, 90s, even the early aughts, basically up until 2009, public approval of Congress vacillated between about 30 to 50%. And then starting with 2009, it's gone down pretty consistently to hit a low point around 11 to 12%, and then we've been bouncing around 11 to 12 to 20% over the last several years. So it's clearly the case that the mass public thinks Congress is a wreck. Also true, however, consistent with longstanding research by political scientists, that when polled, individual voters would say, sure, Congress is horrific, but my member of Congress is doing great, or I always approve my member of Congress. On the one hand, that might give us faith in the virtues of electoral accountability, but then thinking more broadly about the theme of today's discussions, it's useful to ask, well, why is it that some people are generally in favor of their own members of Congress, but are opposed to the institution, and what might be driving that approval? And in engaging that question, it's helpful to recognize, and this once again builds on a point that Rachel really just hit on perfectly, in my opinion, that being that the extent to which we see either the realization of polarization or the presentation of polarization, or the extent to which members of Congress, the president, politicians broadly speaking, are trying to present us as a polarized nation. In my opinion, this is largely an artifact of entrepreneurial politicians recognizing a specific electoral strategy to facilitate them obtaining office and retaining office. We now see a situation, when we think about America being polarized, it's really important to recognize there's been some pretty significant geographic sorting over the past 40 to 50 years. All America was always here, okay? It's just the case that people are living in different places and they're interacting with each other in a bunch of different contexts. Just because people have moved across the country and become more geographically clustered doesn't mean we're really dealing with a different country. It's more the case that our geographic orientation is now heavily correlated with our socioeconomic status, which in a lot of cases is notably more correlated with our racial or ethnic makeup, which is likely also correlated with political parties. But the extent to which it's correlated with our political party affiliation, it's entirely because of the fact we have entrepreneurial party leaders who have recognized the ways in which geographic sorting has now met with these other factors and have reached out to form new voting blocks. What we think of today as the Democratic Party is not the way the Democratic Party looked 20, 30, 40 years ago, nor does the Republican Party look like that. And the extent to which many of us in the public sphere are concerned about the scope of perceptions of polarization or the realization of polarization, it's important to recognize that politicians in the broadest sense are going to essentially continue to engage in various tactics so long as they're rewarded by that electorally. The last point I'd like to raise, which is hopefully a point of optimism, actually, which comes back to what I was saying before, That being that contrary to what people think, Congress is not as polarized as it's ever, or more polarized than it's ever been. I'd also like to hammer home the point that contrary to what people think, there's lots of meaningful lawmaking that still occurs in Congress. And we could think about this in a variety of contexts. Just on a case-by-case basis, we could think about my own senator, for example, outgoing or retiring Senator Lamar Alexander. If we think about his legislative engagement across the course of his career in the Senate, but most recently, even during the Trump administration, there's been a notable body of legislation that he's moved through his committee in the Senate that's been bipartisan in spirit and is engaged with substantial problems that are facing the American public involving education, opioid addiction and treatment, and related issues. Now, many people might look at this and say, well, perhaps Lamar Alexander, he's cultivated a reputation for being relatively centrist across the course of his career, and he's really an outlier. That might be true, but also we could point to people such as former member of Congress Barney Frank or Henry Waxman, who most people would point to as being very proud, open liberals. Considering their legislative careers, and when pressed, they're the first persons to say that the key to their legislative effectiveness was their ability to find partners across the aisle among Republicans, or at least ideologically diffuse partnerships. And more generally speaking, coming back to our research on bipartisan lawmaking, we could point to, across a consideration of 45 years of data, that Republicans and Democrats, those who essentially are more effective at moving their legislative agenda through the lawmaking process, are those that are able to secure a wide range of bipartisan co-sponsors. And it's also the case that the act of engaging in bipartisan co-sponsorship, you actually putting yourself out there to support someone else's legislation, actually contributes to a virtuous cycle, for a lack of a better phrase. We reach out, we support other people, they support us, and ultimately things move forward. And contrary to the way it's perceived or presented, there's a non-trivial number of members who are currently sitting in the United States Congress who made a career of doing this and have been quite successful at moving their legislative agendas through the process. So hopefully not all is broken, but there's a lot of things to think about moving forward.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. We've covered a lot of ground already, and just in the interest of our limited time remaining, I'd love to just pose one sweeping question to all of you looking forward, and just invite some discussion around it, and leave our conversation with that forward look towards solutions. What research needs to be done? What questions need to be answered in order to surface solutions to affective polarization? What are the next frontiers of questions and challenges that funders and field leaders and scholars and the people represented in this audience need to take on in order for all of us to be effective in addressing these challenges?
I'll happily jump into the fray. It was such a pleasure to hear my fellow commentators. Clearly, we're all wrestling with the same topics. And to me, one of the big issues is that these entrepreneurial politicians are responding to incentives. And those incentives need to be altered in order to change the politicians. But we don't know what the effects of altering some of those incentives might be. So there's a body of research, or there's a body of groups that are working on the individual level to heal people on a one-on-one bridge divides type of way. Then there's a body of groups working on things like ranked choice voting and primary reform and so on, or campaign finance to affect the kinds of things that our politicians are responding to with this polarizing rhetoric. I think, first of all, we need more research onto which of those strategies work, or how those strategies work together, what the interface between structural and individual change is. We have some of that research from countries in conflict and countries moving out of conflict, the kind of Northern Ireland and South Africa situations. We don't know how much that applies to our own country that isn't quite that far along. So I would love to see more research in that field generally, and then on the outcomes of some of those changes, which is hard because we don't have a lot of natural experiments. But I know New America has done a lot with ranked choice voting. They're running kind of a prize competition, and we need more of that.
Professor Wiseman, maybe I could just put you on the spot real quick, because I know you have to jump off, and then Dr. Crayton, maybe you can close us out on this point. Thoughts, Professor Wiseman?
Yeah, once again, I would emphasize the points that Rachel said. I think right now, in certain ways, it's kind of a growth industry for people who are interested in political science, because all the points you raised, Sarah, There's arguments being made that our institutions are being challenged or they simply weren't meant to function in this current environment. From my perspective, it's not entirely clear that's true. I think essentially we have self-interested politicians. We've always had self-interested politicians. So as Rachel said, the question is, well, how are they going to respond to certain incentives if we tweak the incentives? And likewise, what are the consequences of them going to be? Issues involving electoral consequences from actually shifting electoral mechanisms. We don't have nearly enough scholarship on this, both in the comparative context and the American context. From where I sit, actually studying legislative politics, the United States Congress hasn't changed dramatically from an institutional perspective across the past 200 plus years. We are fortunate in the sense we actually can draw on lessons from state legislatures in 50 different states. And some of the work that myself and my co-director, the Center for Effective Lawmaking, Craig Bolden, do is to actually try to explore essentially the ways in which different institutional designs contribute to or detract from effective lawmaking in these states, to hopefully provide us with some guidance for institutional reforms to Congress. But I think once again, issues involving electoral reform or reforms to electoral institutions are key. If for no, and not to say that we should be adopting these reforms, but I would very much want us to ensure that any effort to adopt reforms is actually based on some meaningful theoretically based research or large sample empirical evidence. Likewise, the same with the legislative reforms. And at the most fundamental level, and this gets back in certain ways to the points that some of the speakers are raising in the opening panel, I think there really needs to be some meaningful psychological research to actually identify the extent to which different messages do or don't resonate with different stakeholders, and then the actions they take thereafter. Because once again, we're in a situation right now that there's some pretty bold claims being made about the efficacy of American institutions and policymaking. All of us agree they're quite important, but at the same point, there's been notably less rigorous scholarship than I think many of us would feel comfortable to engage with a lot of these questions, such that I think I'd be very hesitant to say we should just go out and engage in various institutional reforms. And with that,
Thank you. Yeah, no, please feel free to drop off. I'd love to hear some thoughts from Dr. Crayton, and then I will close us out and turn it back. But please, Dr. Crayton, what would you add in terms of where we need to drive additional resources for study?
Sure. And, I don't disagree with the prior comments about looking at what entrepreneurial politicians do, but that's more on the supply side. It's the demand side that I'm very intrigued and also concerned about, because, you got to have people in the parade before you get the band major or the leader of the parade, depending on your analogy. What I think a lot about are two things. When I do work, and I, spent time in South Africa working as well, when I do work abroad, I'm always fascinated that I get the same question sometimes that I get when I work with community groups here. And that is basic questions about how the system works. And that actually is important, because I think it indicates, and it's not just sort of a one-time thing, and it's not just one racial group or the other. It's an indication that a large swath of people don't really get a handle on what it is that government does, what their role in government is, and what's expected of them. And that's not to say anything negative. I just think that's where we are. And we have to recognize that if we want people to understand and be active, engaged in politics, not just at the 4-year cycle, but every period throughout, we've got to do a better job of talking about why that matters. People have a lot on their agendas, and they also sometimes get sad and really disappointed in the lack of resolve in what government does or doesn't do. So what are the inputs that one can make to help people understand better? And related to that, and Mary mentioned the First Amendment, I'm so glad she did, because it's a thing that has bothered me since law school. We have a very fulsome understanding of the First Amendment. That is the political space where people contest ideas and the best ideas come forward, and government has a limited role in policing that. The problem, of course, is that the model depends upon a society that is good at using critical thinking to divide things that are true from things that are not. Now, this obviously resonates with many of us because we've heard about the war on facts that has existed easily for the last 4 years, probably beyond that, but it's become more clear then. What can we do to assist? And I don't really fault the public with this. If you're looking at things in a limited time, we now have, technical devices now that make it seem as though things that aren't true actually look true. And That's the most extreme version of it. But just in terms of what it is that people stand for, what it is that a policy will do for you, or maybe make things that are difficult, or to deal with nuance. That to me is the question that I think can make a huge difference in helping politicians understand their constituents who are currently in the political system understand, what is and isn't in their interest to choose. And then finally, and this is the crucial piece of it, we often forget there's a huge, sometimes, at least not necessarily in this election, but easily 30 to 40% of this country of eligible voters did not participate. More of them are coming into the system, but what do we get to bring more of them in than we have even now? Some of that is informational, but I think the research into getting after them, in addition to the other things that have been mentioned that are important and right, are crucial. And when we do that, just to take you back to my earlier comment, we have to recognize people are coming in with different experiences and frankly, different orientations to government. How do we help the conversation that has to happen in accounting for what government has done wrong for people and to people, and the things that they need to do along with others that are currently in the system to come to joint understandings about what we ought to do as a country together? Because our governance system depends upon our consent, but we got to be able to collectively figure out what consent looks like.
Thank you both so much. I've been scribbling furiously as you write, because we support research in this space and stand alongside of a lot of other funders who are asking similar questions. So it's just great to hear your thoughts on really where we should focus our time. One thing I'd add, just picking up on what Rachel said about the systemic versus kind of individual level efforts here, and what Sharif, my friend Sharif Azami, said at the beginning of this summit about a lot of this work needing to take place at a heart change individual level. There's some really interesting research out there from social psychologists and moral psychologists around how human beings form moral judgment, why we otherize each other, and to test the efficacy of various interventions to help move us from a place of intolerance and closure to openness and collaboration. So I'd encourage everyone to check out centers like the one at UNC Chapel Hill with Professor Kurt Gray, Greater Good Science Center at Cal Berkeley, Agora Institute, and others who are asking some of those questions, and hopefully we can dive into that more in the discussions today. But for now, I just want to thank our panelists again, thank Mike and Fetzer for having us on here to kick off this conversation. And really invite everyone in this audience to take up your role to play here. As everyone's underscored, this was a long-term challenge in building. It's a long-term challenge in addressing. We're going to need everyone from across sectors, across political perspectives, across experiences to speak into this. And I know the program from here offers you a lot of opportunity to get into the discussion and to participate in a way that surfaces ideas and builds capacities. Please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions or want to dive deeper into what we've discussed today. But otherwise, Mike, I'll turn it back to you.